So now we're going to take a look at the last critical perspective, which is the Marxist theory. Now, the feminist perspective is challenging in many ways, but I think that despite all of the stuff that you're going to see here about the Marxist critical perspective, it's not necessarily that challenging to understand because it's probably better representative of the kinds of struggles we still see today. So, anyone who is going to take a look at a piece of literature from a Marxist literary critical perspective is going to take into consideration some of the basic aspects of Marxist theory and apply them to that piece of literature. So, you need to recognize from that Marxist perspective that the fundamental aspects of the ideology of communism are addressed in some way in a piece of literature that might have Marxist overtones, okay? So, typically, a piece of literature that might have Marxist perspective holds that all people are at least outwardly entitled to enjoy the fruits of their labor. The challenge, though, for the Marxist is that somebody like Karl Marx and later theorists would say that they are prevented from achieving and enjoying all the fruits of their labor by a capitalistic economic system. According to Karl Marx, as things progress, and again, I'm just being as general as I can be to get the point across, as history progresses and we move through phases of economic development, ultimately, we will end in the strongest economies being capitalistic for a short amount of time. But it's not sustainable. According to Karl Marx, capitalism is not sustainable because it divides people into two classes. Class number one would be the non-owning workers, and they would be the 90%. These are the people who do the work on whom the non-working owners stand. So if you're thinking back to world history conversations, maybe AP Euro conversations, we're talking about the difference between the non-owning workers, the proletariat, and the non-working owners, the bourgeoisie. And ultimately, from your maybe study, you might remember that Karl Marx theorized that no matter how strong a capitalist society is, ultimately it will fail because this 90% will rise up against this 10% and they will take over and they will distribute goods evenly so everyone has access to everything they need. Okay? So if Karl Marx was alive today, he would say what we are seeing in the United States is exactly what he predicted. We are at a place where our capitalist economy is probably going to soon show it's running its course. We can't keep moving in this direction. And then according to Karl Marx, eventually we would recognize that, a few people would stand up, then a lot of people would stand up, and then the people who owned would back off and everybody would kind of take care of themselves the way they needed to. Now we've never gotten to this. Karl Marx's theory has not come to fruition. And we've lived very well in the United States on the capitalistic ideal. So whether it ever comes to that fruition, I have no idea. But it makes for a really good lens to study the distinctions between peoples and how the haves and the have-nots have a tendency to work with and against one another. So, what are you going to see in a piece of literature that might be read through a Marxist lens? That's coming up on the next slide here. These are the things that you'll be looking for. So when I give you examples of the de Lacy family situation in Frankenstein, most of those conversations are related to these questions. And that makes the de Lacy family readable from a Marxist perspective. Why? Because ultimately they started out high class and they moved to low class. But according to Frankenstein and Mary Shelley as our author, they didn't really suffer until they met the creature. And so even in losing all their money, they were still able to make a life for themselves. And according to a Marxist, that's the first stage in being able to be self-sufficient. And then hopefully that stage, according to Karl Marx, would move on to take down some of those larger figures in our society that own. There's no reason for the 99% to have, or the 1% to have, and the 99% not to have. So a Marxist critic is a careful reader, and they would keep in mind the issues of power and money that often are associated with conversations about the communist perspective, or the socialist perspective for that instance. These are the questions you'll want to be able to focus on. What role does class play in the work as a piece of literature? What is the author's analysis of class relations? So, talk a little bit, you should be able to talk a little bit about how the de Lacy family, as well as Clerval, represent certain ideologies. How do characters overcome oppression, or do they overcome oppression? Maybe Justine doesn't overcome her oppression, and therefore she is a victim of the bourgeois mentality. She's a victim of capitalism. More likely, Clerval is a victim of capitalism because he dies, and there is no justice for his death because Victor is basically saved from his rantings and ravings as a lunatic by his father's money. Clerval doesn't have money to start. He works for his money. Clerval's father works for his money. And the bourgeois example of life is typically based on passing down inheritance from one family member to the other, which is another aspect of the Marxist perspective that Karl Marx doesn't believe is sustainable. In what ways does work serve as propaganda? In what ways does it keep things the same? Or does it undermine anything about the, the situation that we see? What does the work say about oppression, or are social conflicts ignored or blamed? So I think when you look at the creature and what he says about his situation, you'll recognize that he feels himself the downtrodden. He feels like he has had to work on behalf of his father, who has not taken any responsibility for him. And does the work propose some form of utopian vision of the world, something that could be a solution? It should be noted that while our Marxist conversations in Frankenstein are a decent place to start, when we get to Brave New World, it will be the focus of everything that we do. Because Brave New World posits a beautiful new society that is based on communistic ideals, but then again, it doesn't necessarily look exactly as we would expect a utopia to look after you dive into it a little bit more as well. All right, so before we quit with this, and then I move to other aspects of Frankenstein, I do want to go back and give you a definition for hegemony. You do need to know, because I'm going to ask you a question. I know one of the questions on the test deals with this conversation of hegemony. Hegemony is a system of assumptions, meanings, and values that we take for granted in our lives that shape the way we view everything in our world. Because we are Americans, we have a certain hegemonic perspective on the world. It's our assumptions about the world that are based on the way we grew up and the way things are that surround us. Hegemony. And if you look at hegemony from a capitalistic perspective, when I tell you that there are other places in the world that do just fine in a socialist mentality, when I tell you, go visit Denmark, I know it's cold there, but everybody seems relatively happy and everybody's got access to health care and moms get to stay home with their kids until they're 5 years old, and there's never any question about them going back into the work world because their jobs have been saved for them. Dads get to take off a year with their kids. There's just much more focus on the family. And you say, well, how can they do that? Don't they ever get ahead? And the answer is no, they don't really get ahead, but they don't really worry about it. They are happily middle class. Everyone in Denmark is happily middle class. you would say to yourself, well, ideally that sounds great. Like, I would love to not have to pay for college, because they don't have to pay for college in Denmark, because that's granted to Danish citizens. But there must be some cost. And your hegemonic perspective tells you that a society that is socialistic in nature can't possibly survive, because who's going to be your Steve Jobs? Who's going to do something great? You can only see things from your perspective. Whereas somebody who's Danish would say, I can't imagine the rat race that people in the United States live through, and why would they want to when things in Denmark are so nice? Same thing comes from your perspective. So that's hegemony at work. And you'll see in a couple of instances that I'm going to pull out for you that Victor Frankenstein doesn't seem to understand that there are any other ways that the world can possibly work. His hegemonic perspective is solely based on his narrow-minded view of the world. And that's the hallmark of the Marxist theory. The idea that human beings by nature are pretty narrow-minded, and if they opened up their perspective a little bit, they might find that there are other options in the world. All right, so